Hi, this is the Roland JUPITER Xm. It's a synth that can play 4 different parts or timbres simultaneously and polyphonically, in addition to a 5th drum part. It has the same sound engine as its bigger brother, the JUPITER X, but in a much more portable form factor. It's packed with multiple sound engines or models, both virtual analog and sample-based. You can split parts or layer them, program an arpeggiator or simple sequence per part, or just use the I-Arpeggio feature to play all the parts for you. The biggest question here is how accessible is that much power in such a small form factor? Let's take a look. Let's start with an overview. This is a digital synth with a few engines, a virtual analog emulation engine with specific models for several vintage Roland synths. It also has the ability to play PCM or sample-based sounds from a very large internal database based on Roland's JV5080 with some D50 sounds in there. It also has an RD-based piano engine, and finally it also includes a vocoder. Despite being relatively lightweight, it has a metal top and metal side panels. It also feels very solid and sturdy. It has a 3-octave keyboard with mini keys that are velocity sensitive, pitch bend, and mod wheels that are plastic and are a little on the small side. The XM also has built-in stereo speakers which sound okay, but you really want to use headphones or large monitors to do its sound justice. Let's take a brief look on the panel left to right. You've got controls that are assignable on a per scene basis, the I-Arpeggio, which we'll talk about in depth, basic synth control features, effects sends on a per part basis, and then most of the interaction in programming this synth is with these 16 buttons, and of course the screen and these 2 encoders along with arrows for navigation. The XM can be powered by 8 AA batteries, but they need to have enough juice in them, so regular alkaline batteries won't work. You'll need NiMH ones. Now the XM has the same ZEN-Core engine as its Groovebox brothers, the MC707 and the MC101, as well as the bigger Phantom, but it has this I-Arpeggio feature, which is pretty unique. I'll dive in depth into it later. I'll just say that the reason that it's interesting is that unlike typical arpeggiators that take the keys you hold and play them in various order options, this one spreads these notes in patterns that work across multiple sounds or parts. It also responds to how you play. So let's say I hold these 3 notes, right? It'll play a pattern one way, but if I strum them, it'll play it differently. More on that later. In terms of connectivity, the XM has 5-pin MIDI in and out, expression pedal inputs, 3.5mm audio in, as well as an input for a dynamic mic, 1/4" and XLR stereo outputs, headphone outputs, a USB device connection for MIDI and audio, though it's not class compliant, and a USB host connection for backup and firmware updates. The XM also has built-in Bluetooth capabilities, both for audio, which you can play back through its speakers or through its audio outputs alongside your music, as well as for MIDI over Bluetooth. Streaming audio from my phone worked quite nicely, but there was some latency. Okay, let's dive in. There are a couple of interface hurdles you need to jump over to understand how to use the XM, the different functions or modes of the 16 backlit buttons, and how the menu system works. We'll get to the menu system later. Let's start with the buttons. They're more important for accomplishing basic tasks, and they have 5 different modes. The first mode is scene selection. You press the scene mode, then you choose one of 16 banks. The XM comes with 5 banks of presets. So let's say choose bank 1, and then I choose scene 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so on. You can see the scene name change here. You can also change scenes using the encoders underneath the screen. Once you select a scene, the first thing you want to do is get out of scene mode and move to a different one, because if you change a scene, all the changes you made are lost. Unfortunately, at least as of the current firmware, there's no undo option. Where you'll typically want to go is the next mode for these buttons, which is part mode. This lets you take a look at the various parts that are part of this scene, 4 melodic parts and a drum kit part. That's what you do with the first 5 buttons. Then the next 5 buttons let you choose which of the parts will be played with keyboard control. So if I wanted to control only the drum kit, that's the drum kit I have here in this case. If I wanted to play part 1, right, that's this. Part 2, part 2 and 3, or just 3, and then part 4. Now this doesn't mute the parts, so if I get the I-Arpeggiator going, I can still hear the parts that are controlled by the arpeggiator. So this only disconnects the parts from keyboard control. If you want to mute the parts, you can do that with Shift and the part. Aside from the visual feedback on the buttons, the lower line of the screen tells you what's going on with the parts. So you'll notice the part that's underlined is the part that's being controlled by the panel. If these squares are empty, it means that the parts aren't being controlled by the keyboard, and if you activate them, then the squares are full, which means they are keyboard controlled. If I turn on the arpeggiator, then the parts that are controlled by the arpeggiator have a little plus sign next to them. You can control all 5 parts if you want, and if you hit Shift and mute the parts, then they turn into a minus sign, so you know they're muted. The third use for these buttons, aside from scene and part selection, is model bank selection. So these are my Jupiter sounds, Juno sounds. After I've selected a bank, I could choose different presets in that bank. There are about 100 presets per bank, JX presets. SH. And while the SH was and is a mono synth, if you want, you can disable its mono mode or turn on polyphony and play it polyphonically. Next model up is the XV5080. And there are hundreds of presets here. You can scroll through the presets quickly, by the way, using the left button. And there are 896 XV presets here. Next model up is the RD piano model. It has 5 presets. And the next are just configured to various banks and filters. Now, you can actually customize all of these by holding the Assign button. So let's say I wanted to customize this model bank. I hold Assign, press this, and now I can have it either select a specific synth model, and then choose which model I want model bank 11 to contain. And you can choose a few models if you like. And then the second option is just to have it go by sound category. And here too, you can select multiple categories, and it'll just go through them when you press the button. So let's say I want, these 3 categories to be represented in this model bank. So now as I go through these, I'll have my synth pads or strings, but also let's just scroll through this quickly. Quite a lot of sounds here, as you can see. Also have some pianos. Now there are quite a few other models here beside the ones in the original 5080. This one is probably classiest one, so I guess I gotta play this, right? So analog sounds aren't the only classics here. The XM also has a couple of vocoder models. Anyway, back to these buttons. Like I said, they have 5 uses. So number 1 is scene change. Number 2 is changing parts or editing parts. Number 3 is changing models. Then the 4th function for these buttons is the function function. And this includes both the options here. I touched on mono and unison, and a few other options here like portamento and creating a simple split between part 1 and 2 or dual layer between part 1 and 2. But just like part mode lets you change and edit the various parts within a scene, then in function, or this 4th mode, you can edit the different partials or oscillators in a particular sound. So this classic sound is actually 4 different sounds layered together. It's this, and this, and this, and this, which together gives you this. So anyway, the fourth mode for these buttons is editing the individual partials or oscillators in a particular tone or part. And then the fifth use is the step sequencer. We'll talk about this later, but basically you have a 64-step sequencer, 4 pages of up to 16 notes per step, and again, up to 64 steps in a sequence. So those are the 16 buttons and their 5 modes. We also listened briefly to the preloaded models. Now, these models can live in any one of parts 1 through 4, though the RD model and the vocoder can only live in part 1. Aside from that, you have part 5, which is the drum kit part. And you can choose any one of the kits, either with this encoder or move through the list quickly. With this one, there are 74 kits in total, which include both traditional kits as well as the vintage analog ones. Now, generally, these sounds are polyphonic, but the hats are grouped nicely to choke each other. Now, as of the current version of the firmware, you can't swap out sounds from a kit and bring in sounds from another kit, and you certainly can't bring in external samples like the MC707 or 101. In light of recent firmware updates for the 101 and 707, I would hope that in the future Roland could bring in the option to either sample directly or load up external samples. I don't have any inside info about that, but it would certainly be nice to be able to create your own custom drum kits, as well as bring in external samples for the partials in the synth engine. Okay, let's talk about effects. On the XM, you've got 4 different send effects on a per scene basis: delay, reverb, then chorus and drive. And you can choose the effects engine for each of these 4 effects, for these 4 scene send effects. So for example, let's say that I wanted to change the engine for the reverb. That's in the menus here, right? So go into the reverb effect, and I can choose both the reverb engine, one of a few options here, and of course edit other parameters, like let's say time, and a bunch of other things, quite a lot in here. And this applies to the other effects as well: the overdrive, the reverb, delay, and chorus. Now, aside from these 4 effects, which are global for the scene, you have individual sends on a per part basis, but they have the same parameters for the scene, including, say, for example, delay time, right? You have control over the send per part, but it's the same delay time. You have an additional MFX or master effects per part or per tone. You edit that by either going to the MFX section here or just by holding Shift and turning the MFX knob. You get to the tone MFX section. So yeah, I mean, this list is quite extensive. Slicer, rotary, drive, distortion, amp sims, and yeah, whole long list. Another delay, by the way. So aside from the master delay or the general delay for all scenes, you have quite a few delay options here as well. And yeah, so a lot to play with in terms of MFX. Now, with all these effects and 5 separate parts, things can get pretty busy. So you do have, on a per part basis, EQ controls as well. Scroll through this right over here. And so a nice control over EQ if you need it. Okay, let's move on to the XM's arpeggiator. There are a few reasons why it's called I-Arpeggio or Artificial Intelligence Arpeggiator. It can both respond to the dynamics with which you play, as well as also arpeggiate a few parts at a time in ways that are complementary to each other. So let's take this scene, for example. I have this bass sound and this lead sound. I could turn on an arpeggiator part for any one of them. So let's start with the bass, turn that on. I get that pattern for the bass, and then go over to the lead part, switch that arpeggiator on. get a different pattern. Now, if I turn on beat detection, it'll change the pattern based on how I play. Which I may or may not like. And you can add onto that the rhythm part as well. So if I activate that, get a kick. One little issue here is that when you change a pattern, unfortunately, the pattern stops. As you can see. Now this will also change based on the dynamics of how I play. Like this. Right. The beat changes as well. And there are quite a few rhythm options here. Of course, I can change the overall arpeggiator pattern too. And when you swap arpeggiator patterns, by default, it will also change the tones of the parts that it's arpeggiating. Let's maybe pick something else. Could be subtle. Let's try something else, maybe with a different rhythm. So you need to get to know these. And this can take getting used to. Yeah, and you don't have to have beat detection on if it's too disjointing. See, once you've found a beat you like, then as you change the chords, then the pattern won't change. So that's just the tip of the iceberg of the craziness that this I-Arpeggiator can do. And it can also do boring stuff, right? So if you want to just have a simple pattern, you can have the plain vanilla things, control octave range, or not, and the typical motifs you'd expect. So a few options here. Duration is gate length. Maybe less relevant for this sound. But you've got control over gate length. And you also have swing. So it does the basic arpeggiator stuff too if you want it. Now you could set a different arpeggiator pattern on a per part basis. So this is the ARP edit screen for part 1. This is the one for part 2, part 3, part 4. And so on. Now, alongside the arpeggiator, you can also program a fixed sequence on a per part basis with up to 64 steps. To do that, you press Step Edit. Now, this gives you the option to either start a brand new clean sequence or listen back in time to either 1, 2, 3, or 4 bars and bring in whatever the arpeggiator played. So let me give you an example. In this scene, I had this going on. Just listen to the drum pattern, and I can let it play for a bit. Let's just stop that. Now that pattern was generated by the I-Arpeggio, but I can bring that into the sequencer. Let's go into part 5, and I'll enable the keyboard for part 5 as well. Anyway, if I hop into Step Edit and choose, say, 1 time before to import that, then I now get this pattern into the sequencer. Now on top here you have a hint with what you can do. You can press S3 or S1. So S3 plays back the pattern. And why don't I go ahead and mute all the parts but part 5. Let's try that again. So this is the drum sequence that the I-Arpeggio came up with. And I could go ahead and page through this to see the whole thing. And then move across the grid and add, let's say, a little snare here. So I could go ahead and edit this as much as I wanted, but let's just start a clean one. Now the sequencer can work either for notes or for the drum part. In this case, I'm in a drum part, but I can swap back to a melodic sequencer in a bit. The way this works is a little odd. You select the notes that you want to appear in the sequence, and you can choose up to 16 notes. So say once I press a key, it becomes one of the 16 notes that I can choose. Let's take this as well, say for the kick, and then, all right, this clap and this hi-hat. They all get added to this list of up to 16 notes I can choose from. Now I could go up and down this grid and just add a kick by changing its velocity from 0, and then it'll be in here. If I wanted, I could go ahead and say add the clap here. And this sequence is 32 steps, right? It's got 2 pages, but I could always go into the ARP edit menu and change it to 16 steps. Then go back and edit current. Now luckily there's a faster way to sequence, so I can just hold a step and add a note that way. Say add this one here as well. And it does record velocity as well. And I could add additional notes. Let's say I wanted to add a hi-hat here. I could potentially just do this. So I could keep adding notes here, right, up to 16 notes. You can't do more than that. Now, this sequencing applies to melodic parts as well, like I mentioned before. So if, say I wanted to create a sequence for this piano, I'd go into active part 1, step edit, start with a clean slate. So now I have up to 16 notes to choose from for this sequence. So let's say for this step, I'll pick this chord, and then for this step, I'll pick this one. This note repeated itself, so I'm using it twice here. So I've basically wasted 5 notes out of the 16 notes. This is the sequence. You can create ties, by the way, by holding the first part of the note and extending it. So just tied this note. Let's do it to this one, and then go, say, all the way up here to the first one. So now the first chord will play on one step, and the second one will be tied. And you can delete single steps by holding a button and pressing S1, or just the entire sequence by holding S1 again and confirming. Now you need to tell XM whether to use the arpeggiator or the sequencer on a per part basis. You do that in the ARP edit menu. Just go to step mode and turn on a per part basis. You don't currently have any parameter motion sequencing options, but when we get to the LFO section, I'll show you sort of like a workaround that with the custom steps in the step LFO. Okay, let's move on to sound design basics on the XM. Each of the 4 vintage synth models have a subset of the features of the main new Jupiter X engine. So say, for example, if I pick the SH model, it doesn't have 2 LFOs, so this function isn't available on it. Same goes for functions like ring mod, oscillator sync, or X mod. They also behave a little differently in terms of oscillators. So if you look at the display here on the bottom, the SH101 model has 4 oscillators, whereas if I pick the Jupiter model, it only has 2. So what's the deal with that? Let me just pick an init preset. For that, by the way, you need to go into the right menu and then initialize not the scene, but the tone. So this is the basic Jupiter 8 tone. If I turn the type knob here, I can choose between the different waveforms for oscillator 1 in this case, or partial 1 in this case. Then if I move to oscillator 2, I can pick the shape for that. Now I won't hear it because its level is low. I got to bring its level up. Let's bring down the level of partial or oscillator 1. And now I can pick the shape for oscillator 2. So type controls shape for the 2 oscillators of the Jupiter model. If I go back to the SH model, it's a little bit different. There are 4 oscillators here. Type doesn't do anything. Rather, if I go into the different partials, I can just control their level. So this is the level of the saw, level of the pulse width, then level of the sub oscillator, and finally level of the noise. So a little bit different use of the knobs depending on the model. Personally, I think that these custom controls per model are a nice simplification to get you started with sound design on the XM, but it's probably best just to stick with the new Jupiter X engine for creating new sounds. It's obviously way more complex than the simple vintage models, but once you're there, the interface is consistent. But while we're on the analog model, let's just take a listen to the sawtooth. I think it's pretty good. Nice and bassy. And bright as well. You have 3 vintage filter models on board. R stands for Roland. Right, this is without resonance. And bring up resonance a bit. Nice and chirpy, I think. And this isn't a one-on-one comparison to an SH-101, of course. But I think it definitely has the character. The second filter is a M Moog filter. Without resonance, it's very similar. With I think not too shabby either. Doesn't self-oscillate for some reason. In this model, on others it does. Then S is a sequential model. Very similar, I think. It would have been nice, I think, if they added an MS-20 filter, say, for example, for a different character, as well as an SVF filter. All these filters will lose bass when you increase resonance across the board. So it would have been nice to have an SVF where that doesn't happen. Still very nice filters. Yeah, here we go. This will self-oscillate on the Roland model. These vintage models are really nice, but options open up when you choose one of the more modern models. So in order that this video doesn't get too long, I won't go over every single feature. I don't think that's even possible in the Jupiter X sound engine. Just to give you a taste of what's possible here, like I mentioned before, you have 4 different partials. Each partial can use either one of a number of virtual analog engines or a number of PCM or sample-based sounds. Now, the sound design section of this synth is definitely where it starts to get menu divey. If I go into, say, the tone edit for partial 1, that's the partial that I'm on now, I'll just briefly scroll through what we have here. Notice the part of the options that we're seeing here on the scroll bar. Yeah, I mean, so many options here. Let's scroll down. Before we get to the actual sound, you've got all this. So waveforms, right? You have a choice of any number of core waveforms. Piano. Yeah, this goes on and on. And why not? If you want, you can choose a waveform for the left side and for the right side. So I got a piano on one side and a vintage organ on the other. And this is all just one partial out of 4. All this, by the way, assuming it's a PCM partial. We'll get to other types of partials soon. Then again, we're not going to go through all these, but if TVF, if it's a modern Roland style filter, there are a few options there. And then clearly you can see there's a lot going on here. This is the mod matrix, by the way. You've got a few sources and multiple destinations. 4 slots here. Stereo width, pitch envelope, bunch of options there. Filter envelope, amp envelope, LFO1. LFOs, by the way, have, aside from the typical waveforms you'd expect, also have a per step option. You can have 16 steps. Each step could have a different curve. Once you set the LFO to step, you can configure any one of a number of depth on a per step basis, as well as choose different curves. Unfortunately, there's no visualization for the curves here. You'll need to look at the manual for that, but a lot of options in here as well. There are 2 LFOs, so this is LFO 2. And if we continue to scroll down the parameter list, EQ, synth partials. If you remember, this is our sound. We've got an organ in one ear and a piano in the other. We can choose from a number of other options beside PCM or sample-based. Virtual analog is probably the most easy to understand one, but there are a few others. There's super saw and noise if you wanted. Yeah, so quite a few options here. Let's go through the virtual analog waveforms quickly. So obviously I won't go through every parameter here, but there are quite a few options here too. VCF type, remember before TVF was the Roland digital filter, these are the analog emulations. So there's VCF1, Jupiter, Moog, Prophet 5, these are the options here. And the list goes on. So yeah, that's it. These are all the options for the partials. That's partial 1. By the way, aside from partial options, you also have general overall common tone options. Again, going through these would take quite some time. I'll just briefly scan through them so you can see how much is going on here. So before I talk about pros and cons, I just wanted to talk about the menu structure overall very briefly. This main screen gives you a visualization of both the envelope and the LFO. So as you change these parameters, you'll see that reflected over here for the amp, filter, by the way, or pitch. So representation for each of the envelopes here and the LFOs as well. So as I increase depth, you can see the LFO shape represented here. There's also a fade time, so there's a nice animation of that as well. And then the menu structure is as follows. So going left from the main menu gives you the overall common arpeggiator controls and the part controls for the arpeggiator. Remember, you select which part you're editing using these buttons. Then going back to the main menu and to the right, you've got overall common scene controls, part controls, right, common ones, including level, sends, and even nice micro tuning options right here. Then moving on, zone controls. This too is on a per part basis. So I could set part 1 to be, say, from, whatever, this to this, and then edit part 2, part 3, part 4. So that's zones. Then you can choose the MFX to any one of the number of effects we saw before. Then moving on down right, scene effect controls for the chorus, delay, reverb, and overdrive. Moving on to the right, you've got tone common controls. Sometimes there aren't any common controls, but let's say choose part 1 based on which model I use. Let's say go for the RD model and then go into tone common. Again, won't go over all of these here, but there are quite a few options. Then edit tones on a per partial basis, partial 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then finally, depending on the model, either MFX or some other options. There are some editing shortcuts. So for example, if you hold Shift and turn several knobs, for example, the MFX knob, you'll get to the tone MFX control. If I hold Shift and touch this slider, I'll get to editing the parameter that these sliders or buttons control. And if you hit hold exit and then turn a knob, you can see what its value is set to. So you don't have to turn a knob back and forth to figure out where it's at. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. On the cons side, and I know this is going to sound weird because I usually complain about missing features, I think the XM has a bit too many features for the interface that it has. Now, I'm not saying that I wish it had fewer features, but rather that if the screen would have been a little bit bigger, like the MC707 screen, for example, which controls the same type of engine, it would be a lot easier to figure out what's going on. If you're not into designing your own sounds, it's less of an issue. With thousands of onboard presets, it's pretty easy to find what you're looking for and enhance it by layering sounds without diving into a single menu. Now, since swapping the screen here for the MC707's screen isn't realistic, what I think Roland should do is develop companion software for sound design. A large computer screen would be a great way to get acquainted with what this synth can do, and once you're familiar with the parameters, you could always go ahead and tweak them with the onboard controls. Also, it would be nice if there had been some sort of help for the parameters, so some button that you press that would explain some of the non-obvious parameters, like, for example, MKBCH. What exactly does that mean? What does it do? It would be nice if there was a little help, say if you press a certain key combo. So hopefully these features are added. Until then, if you're into sound design, prepare yourself for a lot of menu diving and have the reference manual nearby. Also expect a learning curve. Another con I mentioned before, for the vintage models, the knobs don't always do what they say on the panel. Obviously, it's hard to replicate so many different synths with a consistent set of controls. That said, it is nice to play with synths that have fewer parameters if you're into sound design and don't want to dig into the menus here. Now, as if the XM didn't have enough features, here are some features I'd wish we'd get in future firmware updates, and I allow myself to be optimistic since Roland just updated the MC101 and the MC707 with plenty of features that were on my and others' wish list. So I mentioned this before, while you have plenty of onboard kits, it would be nice if you could create your own and bring your own samples, as well as bring in samples into the PCM engine. It would also be nice to see the sequencer get more features like additional patterns per scene and more than 16 different notes per sequence, and it would also be nice to see motion sequencing lanes in the sequencer as well. And I may have missed this, but I couldn't find a way to transpose a sequence, so that would be a nice option to have too. One final request, it's nice that you've got categories in the model banks and that you can edit them and change them as you want with the assign button, but it would be great if there was just a search function. If I know that I'm looking for a particular preset, it would be great to type in a phrase and have it search through the database. So those are my requests. On the pros side, first and foremost, what this does, up to 256 voice polyphony, 5-part multi-timbral with thousands of preset sounds and both a PCM sample-based engine as well as a virtual analog engine, which I think sounds pretty darn good, packs a lot of punch in here, both nostalgic and up-to-date. I love the fact that there's enough polyphony here to switch scenes without losing the sound. So I can play, say, this sound, then change the scene, play this sound, in a completely seamless way. That's as far as sounds. The arpeggiator does stop, so it would be nice if there would be an option to keep that going as you change scenes as well. So is this the synth for you? I think it depends on your point of view. If you're into complex sound design, you'll need to get acquainted with the menus and have the patience to go through them. More years ago than I care to remember, I played in a band with friends, and you know how it is. The drummer plays the drums, guitarist the guitar. I'm not even talking about the bassist. And yet somehow I was supposed to come up with every other sound in the book, from strings to pianos to pads. Now, back then I used a MIDI keyboard and this, the JV1010, and I can tell you, I would have much preferred to have an XM nearby. Add to that the ability to arpeggiate multiple parts with a single arpeggiator, or to program individual sequences or arpeggiator patterns on a per-part basis, albeit short sequences, and you have quite a compelling value proposition with the XM. And if you do decide to dive into the world of sound design options available in here, you might want to check out the ideas in my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if you learned something, ring the bell after subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.